that I have noticed is that when people start pulling away, it usually doesn't happen all at once. It is normally little things at first, small shifts, um, different energy, you know. Conversations start feeling a little different than they used to. And that's what makes situations like that confusing sometimes because there's usually no big dramatic moment to point to. Um, Nothing is obvious that happened, but somehow things don't feel the same anymore. And honestly, I think people try to talk themselves out of that feeling at first because nobody wants to immediately believe that something changed or that something feels less connected now, especially when there wasn't anything obvious that happened in the moment. Um, there's just that little less attention, that less presence, that less intentionality that we notice. And what's interesting is that we usually feel it before we understand it. And I don't think that we realize how observant we actually are emotionally. Because even when your mind is trying to make sense of something, deep down, you usually feel the shift first. The conversation feels different. The effort feels different. The energy feels different. Because on the surface, everything still looks normal. People are still talking, still responding, still technically there. But emotionally, something feels less present. Even if everything looks normal on the surface, like nothing happened, but the vibe, it just feels different. And so, because nothing obvious happened, people second guess themselves. You start feeling like maybe I'm overthinking it, you know, but effort has a feeling to it. Consistency has a feeling, presence has a feeling, intentionality, all of that has feeling. And once you've experienced genuine consistency from someone, you notice when it changes, not because you're over analyzing every little thing, but because when someone shows up consistently, um, you get used to that version of them. So when that vibe changes, people feel it. And honestly, I think consistency creates emotional comfort more than we actually realize. You know, Not perfection, but just knowing what version of someone that you're going to get, how they show up, how they communicate. And that stability matters, especially after life teaches you what inconsistency feels like, and when those things change, people notice. Even if nobody says anything, because effort usually doesn't go out with the bang, it quietly fades, and that's through less communication, showing less interest, less consistency, less emotional presence. And sometimes, usually, people start feeling different before they start acting different. And I think that's why people feel confused in these situations, because the change isn't always um, obvious enough to explain right away. And so, honestly, that sometimes is the hardest shift to talk about, because you're trying to explain a feeling before you can even fully understand it yourself. All you know is something feels different, um, something feels less present, something feels less intentional. And people usually don't know that feeling before they know how to put it into words, you know. And I think maybe that's why these kinds of situations, you know, stays on our mind so long, because our mind is trying to catch up with something that we already felt emotionally. And that disconnect can make people question themselves for a long time, you know, and that creates tension internally, because now you're trying to figure out, did something actually change, or am I just imagining this? And honestly, sometimes we wait for words when the behavior already said enough, you know, because effort communicates more than we realize. The way someone shows up, the way they respond, the way they check in and pay attention, that all communicates something, because single moments, you know, those are easy to ignore, but repeated patterns, repeated inconsistency, you know, that repeated emotional distance, after a while, it doesn't feel like a mistake anymore. Mm-mm. It starts feeling intentional, you know, because isolated moments are easy to excuse. You know, we all have off days, we all have days where we're distracted, but having that repeated emotional distance, that repeated inconsistency, you know, eventually the pattern starts speaking louder than your words do. And eventually, patterns become harder to ignore, you know, not because someone announced it, but because the consistency changed. And consistency, you know, it's funny like that, because usually you don't fully appreciate it until it's gone, right? And so maybe that's why people get stuck replaying certain situations in their head, because they're trying to figure out, did something actually change, or am I just tripping? You know, when deep down they already felt the difference. You know, I think people really underestimate how deeply effort is felt emotionally. You know, not because we expect perfection from someone, but because effort creates reassurance, and presence creates reassurance. You know, consistency creates reassurance. And when those things quietly change, we can feel it, you know, even before we fully understand why. And I think the older I get, the more I pay attention to consistency over explanations. Because someone's words, they can calm confusion just temporarily, but their patterns, that's what usually tells the truth eventually. And that's just how I feel about it.